Hey everybody, James from ontype here, and today we're doing an INFJ breakdown. We're going to look at all the different elements that make up an INFJ and describe them. So let's get into it. Alright, so let's get into the kind of breakdown of an INFJ. We're just going to start with the ego functions. We'll go through some of the functions, temperaments, interaction styles, some of the different things that make up an INFJ. And we'll go somewhat in depth. We won't go full in depth just because there's so much to cover. If you guys want more on this topic, then leave a comment down below. I'll definitely get around to going in depth on hopefully all the types eventually. So let's start with these ego functions. This is something that's not something super talked about. There's definitely lots of talk about the functions, especially the first four, but there's not a lot of understanding of how these functions kind of work. So what is it like to be an INFJ having NI hero? So NI hero, heroic with their freedom, their desires, their hopes, dreams, decisions, and future. So what does that mean? So it basically means that they can look pretty optimistically towards their future, what they're going to do, their plans, their desires, their dreams, their choices, kind of who they want to be. So they have a really idealistic and heroic idea of who they want to be. I want to do this. This is who I want to be. This is my character. This is kind of who I choose to be. I'm going to choose to be this person. This is my decisions that will make me this person. This is where I want to go. This is my plan. This is my goal. That they're going to have hope. They're not going to be kind of giving up a lot. Very tenacious. INFJs very, very tenacious. Don't want to give up. Still want to see a path forward. See a path to the future that can be better. See a way, right? It's all about the way. It's all about finding the way. So, and I hear all about the way. All about finding that path, that way. What's the best path forward? So they're very, in general, hopeful. Obviously, it depends on your cognitive focus. If you're shadow focused, you're going to be in a more despair headspace than if you're, more evenly balanced. But in a general, very mass data sense, INFJs overall are going to be hopeful because they do have NI hero as their first function. And if you're curious, if you're an INFJ, this is a great way to kind of learn more, learn about the functions, learn to type yourself. It's a great way. I'm hopefully going to do more on each type so that if you're not sure, you're not 100% sure in your typing, it can be really hard with the tests, the different information, the different sources, the different opinions. But it's a great way just to kind of really understand the fundamentals and start to try to apply that to yourself and see, does that resonate with you? Does that make sense? But yeah, really, really decisive. NI hero definitely wants a lot of things. It's going to want a lot of things. It's going to be, it can be impulsive, but it's also going to be a little less impulsive than some types because it does understand their future to a well enough degree that it won't always make really risky decisions that are going to harm their future. And they have any Nemesis, we'll get into that later, that has enough paranoia to keep them out of trouble a lot of the time, but definitely not always. We can talk about that a little later. NI hero can be risky, it can be very courageous, it can be very brave, it's willing to lay it on the line, like to live is to risk it all. They're definitely willing, but they're not necessarily going to be the type that's going to be incredibly impulsive and ignoring the future because they still have that as their first function. They want to be heroic. They don't want to make irresponsible decisions necessarily, but they have so much optimism with their decision making they can, and they can definitely make a lot of different choices. And one of the kind of things that INFJs have to work on, of course, is being more responsible with their choices because it can be easy to kind of let that hero function do its thing, make the choices, go with the choices, bang, 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 just keep following your gut, keep following your intuition. But that can definitely lead you into trouble if you're not processing it and trying to be responsible. But that's really the kind of peak of an INFJ. It's going, I want to be this person, this is who I want to be, this is where I'm going, trying to have integrity, trying to have character with that NI, and trying to make sure that they are aligned with what they want and making that decisions, making big, really NI hero wants to make big decisions and wants to make the life-altering decisions. When it comes to a small scale of kind of day decisions, definitely harder for an NI hero when it comes to maybe being as responsible. It can be more impulsive when it comes to those smaller decisions, but when it comes to really big life-altering decisions, which path to take, they can definitely spend a ton of time thinking about that, a ton of time considering that, and try to make the best choice they can. And then we have FE in their parent slot, their second function under NI, of course. A little more pessimistic in that second slot if you know anything about the functional optimism and pessimism. If you don't, just know that, as the functions get lower, overall they get more pessimistic. And to get into more detail on that, I do have a book coming out, Advanced Guide, and even our handbook for free gets a little into that. But for now, let's just focus on kind of FE and that parent slot. Really responsible with trying to be kind, trying to be ethical in general, helpful, trying to kind of impart wisdom onto others, contribute value onto others, make sure that they're doing something that helps others. It's their first extroverted function. So when they're dealing with other people, they really want to make sure they're not being mean. They want to make sure that they're not causing conflict or, making people upset. Does that mean they'll never ever make people upset? Of course not. But in a general sense, they want to avoid conflict. They want to keep the peace. That's how that FE parent really works. Because they're introverts, they don't interact with their extroverted world in always a very overtly optimistic way. They're kind of interacting with their extroverted world in a pessimistic sense of kind of a skeptical view of like, I just want to make sure I'm not upsetting anyone. I just don't want to make anyone unhappy. I don't want to hurt anyone's feelings. And it's kind of from that defensive point of view, because the second and fourth functions are often very defensive functions, whereas the first and third are more offensive. They're more tackling life's problems kind of in a more kind of offensive, not offensive in a bad way, but in a more kind of, what's the right word? I can't quite think. Proactive. In a more proactive way. They're proactively tackling problems. The hero and child, that is, are more proactive. Whereas the parent and the aspirational, and unless it's in an aspirational state, is a little more defensive, a little more reactive, trying to make sure that they're keeping things, kind of not too crazy. They're not going too far with it. That's really default state to keep in mind. There's different focuses, different developments, different maturities, different life paths that will change that slightly. But for the most part, that's kind of a general way that they view these functions. And then we have their TI in their third slot. So that's going to be the child function. So they're very much about the truth, about kind of that purity of making sure that they're honest, trying to be objective and logical. Although, because it's a child function, it can struggle with objectivity. It can be subjective if they kind of resort to their critic function instead and get really down on themselves, guilty, ashamed, and they're not being as objective. But in general, they want to be honest. They want to think things through. They want to be analytical. But it can be kind of childish where they might think, about certain things, but not about others. And they might not want to think about things that aren't true. They just want to think about things that are. And it can definitely end up being a little bit ignorant because it's not always going out of its way to learn everything. It just kind of wants to learn what it wants to learn. And when it wants to learn something, it can be very proficient. But it can often just not care about a lot of different things because unless they have an ethical purpose, it doesn't really care. INFJs in general won't care as much to be motivated by it because that NI and the FE are the top two. They want ethical motivation. That's a great way to sum it up. NI-FE. NI being motivation, desire, and FE being ethical and helpful. So if there's no ethical reason to learn something, they might not bother. If there's no real benefit to their future, they might not bother either. So there's some different motivations that go into how ignorant or analytical they're going to be. And then we have SE in that aspirational slot. So for this function, it's very aspirational with their performance, their skills, their impact in general, and reality, right? SE is all about reality. So a lot of people talk about INFJs hating reality, wanting to avoid it, and yeah, that can definitely be true. I think a lot of those people are actually mistyped as they're actually NPs, but INFJs in general do want to impact reality. They want to make a difference. They want to change the world. They want to have skills and an ability to socialize on a performative scale. Even if it's scary, they know that when I do it, I'm able to practice, I'm able to learn, I'm able to achieve those kind of goals. And so it's definitely not something to shy away from in general, but INFJs, aspirational functions, there's two main kind of modes of thinking. There's the avoidance and there's the courageous kind of way of viewing such a polarizing function where it can be so all or nothing. So there can be the avoidant kind of style of dealing with the aspirational function where they avoid it in favor of getting to kind of be in their shadow. And one thing to understand about the shadow, although this isn't a video just on that, the shadow is a little bit, there's a little bit of gravity to it. You get pulled into your shadow very easily. It's easy to fall into your shadow. It's quite hard to go up against gravity, right? So it's quite hard to go into your subconscious, go into an aspirational phase versus falling into your shadow. The gravity pulls you there. So it's very easy to avoid the kind of the fear and avoid the kind of scary reality and just fall into your shadow and have those unhealthy kind of coping mechanisms to deal with the fact that you're not getting the happiness that you need to get. That's the little kind of dirty secret about analytical psychology, is that the only pathway to happiness is through fear, and the weapon is courage. So using the weapon of courage to defeat the enemy of fear, you can achieve happiness. People want happiness without having to go through the fear, and they substitute that with pleasure. Pleasure is not the same as happiness. They're very synonymous words, but if you understand pleasure as instant gratification and happiness as delayed gratification, that's one way to think of it. And that kind of instant sensory pleasure can be used, especially when people are avoiding their aspirational function. But if they want happiness, if they want true satisfaction, they need to deal with that fear. And for INFJs, they need to deal with that fear too. And the way they can deal with that fear is face reality. You really want to avoid things that take you away from reality. And this is something that I've always struggled with personally, wanting to detach from reality, wanting to, I'm scared about something that I have to face. I'm just going to go on the internet, I'm not going to face that thing, it's super easy, or I'm going to binge eat or something, where it's like, I'm just going to bomb my SI, and we'll get into that later of kind of how that shadow gravity can pull you in there when you're not facing those fears. But the fears of performance anxiety, fears of a test, of interacting with others, it might be, the fear might be just in general facing reality, of facing things that are true about reality, of like what your skill development is, or you're not where you want to be, or your fantasy world and your reality are very different, and facing that and kind of acknowledging that, and then taking concrete real world steps to get there. That's the process, but it can be very scary to face, and I think it's very easy to avoid that. And that avoidance style for INFJs, we'll get into that a little later of how it goes to their SI demon, and how they will gravitationally be pulled down into that shadow, and what that coping mechanism is. But it's super important for INFJs to achieve their subconscious. We're not getting too in deep with the 4 sides of the mind in this video, but basic things to understand, practice your skills, work to overcome whatever you're afraid of, you want to do that as much as possible. Be outgoing, go out there, do things that scare you, get practice with them, become very practiced, and that practice will turn into confidence. So that's really what's important for INFJs. And then we get into the shadow functions, kind of where they can be pulled very easily when they don't want to address some of those fears and responsibilities that come with your ego functions. So then we have any Nemesis. So any Nemesis worries about what can happen, what can go wrong, the worst case scenario, the negative possibilities, right? Well, any Nemesis can see some positive possibilities. It really worries about the negative. So it's going to worry a lot. It's going to be very anxious, very, very poor stress management, definitely fearful about things going wrong, worried that what they want won't come true because things out of their control will happen. Definitely worried about what they can't control, which, of course, one of the great kind of wisdoms of the world, that was poorly phrased, but something smart to definitely think about is that, don't worry about what you can't control. And that's really a huge issue for INFJs, is worrying about things that basically they have no control over. And that's a huge kind of point of their worries, worrying about things happening in the kind of metaphysical realm, possibilities coming true that are negative, that will prevent them from getting what they want, or prevent them from whatever their goals are. And this kind of general worry, this kind of general paranoia can definitely sabotage them. If they're too worried, they're too paranoid, if they assume things will happen that won't, and it can be a little bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy where they might observe some negative possibilities, and because of these possibilities being observed, they assume it's going to come true. And one really important thing to kind of think of as an INFJ is, possibilities are not probabilities. Just because something can happen doesn't mean it's probable, doesn't mean it will, doesn't mean it's likely, doesn't mean it's going to. So it's really something to kind of keep in mind when you're afraid of that. Another really big tenet of any Nemesis that you will see is the kind of worry that others won't want them, worries that they're not desirable. That comes from, they know they desire others a lot. They know instinctively that others don't desire them as much as they desire others in many cases. And they can read on that, and they can worry about that, and worry that, other people won't want them, other people won't choose them, and that worry can definitely inhibit their social confidence and inhibit them from achieving their aspirational as well. Then we have FI Critic, which is important to talk about. It kind of interacts with TI Child. TI Child can be a little childish with what it thinks, and if it ends up sinking to its shadow, it can definitely resort to its emotions and feeling down about itself. So it might be like, it's true that I feel like I'm bad at something, so therefore I am bad at something because I do feel that way, and that's true. And a very kind of childish logic loop of I feel bad, therefore I'm bad, which isn't logical necessarily, it's not objective, but being pulled into that subjective realm in their shadow, being very critical of themselves, their own feelings, their own worth, their own goodness. This is another misconception that INFJs are into self-love and into loving themselves, and this is just because they're mistyped, often INFPs, which is just a mistyping on the test. But not true at all for INFJs. Any INFJ is extremely down on themselves. They're going to be self-critical. They're going to put themselves down. They're going to be extremely humble when it comes to their goodness. If people compliment them, they're going to hate being complimented. They're going to put themselves down. Someone says you're good, they're going to say they're bad at it. That's just what's true. And if someone's not doing that, they're probably not an INFJ. So that's something to really keep in mind, unless it's an extremely mature INFJ who's much older, who can has achieved a lot more wisdom and self-love, but it's an extremely difficult path, so I wouldn't expect that behavior from anyone in your life. So yeah, super hard on themselves, super critical, perfectionist. FI Critic wants to be perfect, because if it's not perfect, it's bad. It really wants to be have a way of living so perfectly that they don't feel bad about themselves, but there's really no way to do that. So it can be extremely hard. Perfectionist with no actual ability to achieve the perfection. Really low self-esteem, self-destructive, lacking that self-love. Absolutely true. And we have the TE Trickster. So TE Trickster is kind of unaware or blissfully wants to be ignorant of reputation, what other people think. The TI Child works in a way where it's very innocent. It's very, it very much looks at what's true. It doesn't care as much about what people think, because it understands that what people think and what is actually true are often wrong. They're often disconnected. And so it'll really look at what's true, and it will be like, who cares if people think something? It doesn't mean it's true. Of course, one thing that is true is that if people think something that's not true, it can be important to change their minds. And TE Trickster will often avoid wanting to change other people's minds or worry about that too much, because they don't really want to have to deal with it. They just want to be believed and say the truth, and they just want people to accept it. They don't want to have to argue with people all the time. They don't want to change everyone's minds necessarily. Also, they in general don't want to have to worry about reputation. They don't want to have to show off their money, show off their fame, show off their reputation, show off their achievements in a way that will convince people to think highly of them. Because they think, well, I respect everyone. I hope everyone respects me. I don't want to think about it. I don't want to have to brag. I don't want to have to be arrogant. And that's just kind of their perspective. They don't want to have to do that, and they generally kind of ignore that side of their mind. And then we have the SI demon, which we kind of talked about in relation to the SE aspirational. When you take that avoidance style of the SE, you avoid reality, avoid fear, avoid failure, avoid rejection, avoid socialization. Those are very big ones for SE aspirational. When you avoid that, it will go inwards, and it will become very self-destructive, hedonistic, bad habits, definitely very, very much focus on that kind of self-destruction of very much like, well, nobody's in my life, nobody supports me, and so it's all very destructive, very hateful towards its own experience, its own comfort, its own needs, things that it has to do. And so it can be very self-destructive when it's being avoidant. But another thing to think about as well is that it also can really hate doing things they need to. So SI Demon doesn't want to have to do things just because they have to. They want to be above that. They want to be ahead of that. They want to be able to make choices on other things that are more important to them than things like, oh, I have to brush my teeth. Oh, I have to do this. Oh, I have this obligation. Oh, I have to go to work. And SI Demon really hates that. They want the freedom with their NI Hero. They want the possibilities. They want to be able to choose anything they want. They don't want to have to be forced into a path. So that's something to know as well. If you're dealing with an INFJ, the worst thing you can do is tell them they have to do something, they should, that they're forced, that they're obligated, they don't get a choice, they don't get to make that heroic choice, because really, INFJs just want the freedom to get to make the right choice. They want the opportunity that they'll be given choices with trust that they will make the right choice. And if they're not trusted enough to make the right choice and they're just forced to do something, they can really hate that. So that's something to really keep in mind about INFJs. And we have their temperament. INFJs are idealists, so they're very idealistic, they're very relationship focused. The number one priority to them is the people in their life, their relationships, the kind of future good that comes from social relationships, and just generally being idealistic about the future, hoping that things will improve, and especially their own future, hopeful and idealistic about the things they want, the things that they care about. and hoping to change the kind of social realm in an idealistic way, making idealistic choices that will end up impacting the world. And they're definitely inclusive. They're affiliative types. They want to include others. They want to work with others. They want to work as groups. They don't always want to just do things alone or independently or pragmatically. They want to work with others, make sure that they're including others, and that they're kind of moving the future forward in a very social and connected way. That's something to know about them compared to some other types. And we have their interaction style, so similar to, the other obviously finisher types and INTJs if you're kind of debating between different types. Very direct, straight to the point, so when they're talking, they're going to generally want to keep it to as few words as possible to get their point across, be very direct. They're not going to dance around the issue. They're not going to be very cryptic or kind of, be misunderstood. They're just going to be direct. They're just going to get to the point. They're responding, so they want other people to initiate topics. They have that strong internal world. They're going to not necessarily openly share about themselves, openly initiate things very easily. They can force themselves to because they're still idealists. They're still social. They still really care about their relationships. So they will put effort into being more extroverted. But in general, they want other people to ask them things. They want other people to talk about themselves, other people to do the talking, do the initiating. They don't want to always have to bring up topics. And they're also progression types, so they want that forward progress, forward movement. They want to know that things have life, things have kind of energy to them. Things aren't stagnant or stale. They want movement. They want to progress. They want to know they're moving towards an end goal. They want to know they're moving and progressing towards their future. In general, being a finisher type means they want to see things through. They don't want to leave things unfinished. They want to know that they got to the end, that they got to their desired kind of goal that they have for themselves. And they generally want to progress things towards that goal. So yeah, that's kind of some of the basics of an INFJ. I could go way in depth about every function, and I have on my book. So I wrote a book about INFJs, for INFJs, by an INFJ. It's extremely in depth. It goes into each function. It goes into each part of their temperament, interaction styles, relationship advice, career advice, personal advice. It goes into a ton of different information. It's quite long. It's on the site ontype.ca/INFJ. It's extremely informative. It tells you a lot how to deal with your hero function in all these different ways, the benefits, the downsides, some techniques in relationships when you're alone or individual. It goes into depth on all these different topics. It's extremely in-depth, extremely helpful, and if you're an INFJ or you're just wanting to know more about INFJs, or you are in a relationship with one, or you just are interested in learning more, it's an extremely useful tool. And I will be doing more books on the other types eventually, and having kind of that super in-depth guide for all of them. So if you're looking for that information, you're looking for some advice, you're looking for kind of something to learn about yourself or about others, that's an absolutely amazing tool, and it's on the site right there. So I hope you guys enjoyed and know a little bit more about INFJs and how they work, and if you want more and more in depth, I can definitely do that, and just let me know down in the comments. I hope you guys enjoyed, and subscribe down below if you did, and have a great day.